Welcome to the video demo series for Configure.IT. Unleash the hassle-free way to build bug-free mobile apps in the quickest possible turnaround time. In this video, we're going to talk about app user registration, login, and how to use social media login such as Facebook and Google login. And so we're going to walk through how to set up the tables, how to set up the APIs, and how to set up the front end. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and set up our tables. Now, the way we do this is because we're using social media login, we actually want to keep our data separated. So we're actually going to create 4 different tables. So the first table we're going to create is our user account. And this is basically just going to be a pivot table, and we're going to call it user account. And we'll go ahead and use 5 fields. And the category we're going to select as user, and we'll go ahead and click add. So the only thing we really want to store in this table is anything associated with the account as a whole, and that it has nothing to do with what account they registered for, or even a name, password, or anything. We don't want to store anything in this table that has anything to do with that. All we want to do is maybe store the date added, and we'll go ahead and add that. And we want to store maybe our date modified, and go ahead and store the status. And we'll go ahead and remove the empty fields, and we'll save and close. So as you can see, we have our account ID, and this is what's going to be the pivot for everything. So we'll use this quite a bit. And let's go ahead and add another table. So we'll come back to our database configuration. And now what we want to do is go ahead and add our table for when the user signs in via our email. So we're going to give them the user the option to sign in with an email address and create their own password. So we'll go ahead and create that table now. This table is going to be called user email login. And the category is going to be user. And the number of fields, we're going to need about 7. So we'll go ahead and add that. And the first field is going to be first name, so we'll do V first name. And the next one is going to be V last name. Then the next one will be email, so it'll be V email. And the next one will be the password, so V password. And then we'll come over here, and again we'll add the added date, and we'll add the modified date, and we'll add the status. So we'll click save and close. Now we also need to add one more field, and we're going to do that. We're going to come over and click add new, and we just need to add one more field. And the field that we need to add is going to be our foreign key that is going to link up to our account, our user account table. So what we're going to do is we're going to, this is going to be an I user account ID. And we'll click save and close. So now we want to come to our relation views. And our iUser account ID, we want to go ahead and assign this to our user account ID right here. Okay, and then we'll click save. So now what we've done is we've just made this iUser account ID the foreign key that links it back to our user account table that we created at the beginning. And we can go back to our database configuration. So now what we want to do is work on the external providers. For example, when a user logs in via Facebook or Google, we want to go ahead and have those listed. And the reason we separate these out so that later on down the road, if you want to add other external providers, this is a simple way to be able to do that without having to expand your tables. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and add our list of providers. So we'll come over here and click on add new. This table is going to be external auth provider, and we'll select user, and 5 fields should be fine. So we'll go ahead and click add. Now the first thing we want to do is do the name. So this will be the Google, the Facebook, the Twitter, the LinkedIn, whatnot. And we'll go ahead and change this to 20. The next thing we want to do is just go ahead and have our added date. and our modify date, and then we'll go ahead and have a status as well. We'll remove the empty rows and save and close. And now, because we only have a couple of records for this, we want to go ahead and add those records. So we'll just manually add them in the table. So the first one we're going to do is Facebook. And the date added, we'll do today. And the modified date, we'll do today as well. And the status will be active. We'll click submit. And we'll add the second one, and we'll add Google. And we'll add the dates again. And the status will be active. And at this point, those are the only two we're going to add. Again, if you needed Twitter, or if you wanted LinkedIn or any of our other integrations, feel free to add those right here. So now what we want to do is go ahead and add the table that will store all of our external logins. So what we want to do is come over here and click Add New. This table, we're going to do user underscore external login. And the category is going to be user. And the number of fields, we're going to start off with 10. Click Add. So the first field we want is our user account ID. So we're going to do an integer, user account ID. And remember, that's going to be the foreign key that goes back to our user account table. The next one is we want our foreign key from the external authentication provider. And this one we'll just do auth provider. Now the next one we want to do is go ahead and get our external user ID. So we'll do a v external user ID. And this is going to be the value that is actually given to us from Facebook and from Google that will tell us what their user ID is. The next one, we want to go ahead and get the first name. And we'll go ahead and get their last name. We'll get their email. And we'll go ahead and get the added date. We'll get the modified date. And we'll get the status. Okay, we'll go ahead and remove the empty rows. We'll click Save and Close. So now that we have the fields added, we want to go ahead and assign the relations. So we'll click on Relations View. And the user account will come down, and we're going to select the user account ID right here. And the auth provider will go ahead and scroll down, and it's going to be the auth provider ID right there. We'll click Save. All right, so now that we have our table set up and configured, why don't we go ahead and start working on the APIs. So to create API, we're going to come over to our MySQL API. And the first API we want to go ahead and create is a registration API. So we'll click on Add New. And this API we're going to create is called User Email Registration. The category we'll do is User. And the input parameters are going to be first name. And that's going to be a required. The second one is going to be last name. And that one will be required. Then we'll get their email. And that one will be required. And it's going to have to be in the email format. And the last one will be password. And that one will be required as well. We'll click Next. So the first thing we want to do is see if that email already exists in our user email table. So we're going to select a query. And we're going to choose user email login. And we'll just return one maximum record. And we want to go ahead and return the user account ID. And we'll click Save and Next, where the email equals our email. And we'll come up here and change the query to check email table. And click Save. Now we're going to add a condition block. And what we're going to do is we're going to check that flow, the check email table. And if it's a success, then that means that the email that they've given us already exists in our table. So we're going to say email exist. And to the right, we're going to insert a finish block. Okay, so we're going to say it's a failure. So we're actually going to come up here and say it's a failure. And the message is going to be your email is already registered. We'll click Save. What we've done here is we've checked to see if the email exists in our email table, but what we also need to do is check to see if the email already exists in our external authentication table. So we need to add an additional query. So we're going to insert to the left. And this query is going to be check external table. This one is going to be the user external login, and we'll click next. And we want to return this user account ID, and we'll click Save and Next. And where the email equals the input email. And we'll click Save. And so now what we need to do is add another condition block. And this one we're going to say external email exists. And it's going to be the flow. And we're going to check the external table flow. If it's a success, then that means that the user has previously registered with either Facebook or Google. So now what we need to do is add a finish block to the right. And again, we're going to say this is a failure. Uncheck all that, and it's going to be a bad request. Change the success to 0. And the message is going to be you have already registered with an external source. And we'll click Save. Okay, so at this point, we've checked to see if the email exists in our email table. And then we've also checked to see if it exists in our external table. At this point, if it doesn't exist in either one of those tables, then it's a new user. So we'll go ahead and do an insert. So we're going to insert to the left. All right, and this one's going to be insert user data. And the query type is going to be an insert. And we want to insert into two places. We want to insert a user account. So we're going to go ahead and use user account, and we'll click next. And so what we want to do here is go ahead and do our add a date and our modify date and our status. So for our add a date, we're going to check this box. And what this box tells us is that this right here is going to be an MySQL function. And we're just going to do now. And the modify date is going to be the same thing. Now. And then our status, we're going to change it to active. And we'll click Save. Now we want to do another insert query, and this one is going to insert into our user email table. So we're going to do insert user email data. Okay, and we're going to do an insert. And we're going to insert into the email login. And we're going to click next. All right, so now we want to go ahead and do our first name, our last name, email, password, add a date, modify date, status, and our user account ID. So now let's go ahead and assign all the parameters. So the first name, we're going to choose our input parameter first name. Our last name, we're going to choose our insert parameter last name. The email is going to be our email. Now our password, we've talked about this in previous videos where we actually want to call a PHP function. And so let's go up here and take a look at our PHP functions. And again, you've seen this one before, this hash password. So this is the function that we're going to be using. And again, what this does is it takes the password that's provided and it's going to hash it and it's going to store it in a secure format. So we're going to come back to our parameter here and we're going to type in hash And we're going to scroll down to the bottom where general defined and it's hash password. So it's going to take the password that we're providing here and it's going to send it to the PHP function and it will provide a value back. The date added, again, we're going to come over here and check this box and we're going to type in now. And the same thing for modified. The status, we're going to change to active. And the user account ID, we're going to actually insert, if we scroll down to the bottom, this insert user data from the previous query. We're going to take that insert ID and we're going to pass that along. Now we can click save. So now we want to do an additional query where it will do a lookup and pass data to the app. So we'll do a third query. And this one is going to be lookup data. So our main table is going to be user account. Now we want to add a relation table, and our relation table is going to be the email login, and we're going to have the user account from the user email login, and it's going to be the same for the user account table. And we'll click next. Okay, so now we want to go ahead and return our user account ID because that's the main ID that we're going to be using for everything in our app that's related to the user. And then for the actual data for each user, we're going to return the first name, the last name, and if we want to return the email, we can go ahead and do that. And we'll click Save and Next. And we want it where the user account ID is equal to the insert ID here, and where the status is active. And we'll go ahead and click Save. Now we can add a finish block. And we want to go ahead and provide this lookup data. And we can go ahead and edit these. So we'll just say this is the user account ID. And this is the first name. And this is the last name. And this is the email. We'll do 200. Okay. The success is 1. And the message will be account has been added. And click Save. So now we can go ahead and test this API. So we'll come up to the top here and we'll type in a J. The last name will be J. And the email will be j@j.com. And the password, of course, will be J. We'll hit debug. Okay, so we got a message that the account has been added. And you can see here that the account ID is number 1. And we've got a first name or an first name, last name J, and the email j.com. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the values in the table. So we'll close this and we'll look at the table records. And you can see the number 1, and we've got the date added, date modified, and the status active. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the user email login, and we'll take a look at the table records. And you can see here's our email login ID, first name, last name, email. Here's the hash password. There's our added date, our modified date, and the status. And here is our user account ID. So now if we go back to our API and let's try to execute that again and let's see what happens. Okay, so now it worked perfectly. It says your email is already registered. All right, so that's one API down. Now let's take a look at some others. Okay, so now that we have a way for the user to register via email and password, we need to go ahead and provide a way for us to authorize that user when they enter in their username and password. So we'll scroll back up and we'll go to our API configuration, and we're going to add a new API. And this one's going to be called user email verify. And our API category is going to be user. And our input parameter is going to be email. And it's going to be required. And we're going to make it an email format. And then we'll click new. And this one is going to be password. Make that a required field as well. Now we'll click next. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is add a query block so we can go ahead and get the user information. And we'll go ahead and name this get user email info. And the table is going to be user email login. We'll click next. Now we want to go ahead and return the first name, the last name, the email, password, and the user account ID. So this alias key for this password, we're going to go ahead and copy that because we're going to need to use that in just a minute. And we'll go ahead and click Save and Next. And we want it where the email is equal to our input parameter email. Now we'll go ahead and click Save. So now let's go ahead and add a condition block. And we need to do a couple of checks here. The first one we want to check is that we actually found the email. So we'll go ahead and select Flow and get user email. So it was a success, which means we found it. And we're going to name this found email. Click Save. If we didn't find the email, we need to go ahead and insert to the left a finish block. And we're going to change this to login failure. And uncheck that. Status code, we're going to be not found. Success will be 0. And for the message, it's going to be the provided email address is not found. And we'll click Save. So now that we've verified that the email does exist, we can go ahead and continue with the process of authenticating the user. Now, if you remember, we used a hash function to hash the password. Now we need to call an additional PHP function that will hash the provided password and compare the new password with the one that we have stored in our database. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to come to the right and we're going to insert a custom function. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our function that we're going to be using. Okay, so this is the function that we're going to be using. I've gone ahead and titled it Check Password Verification. And basically what this is going to do is this is going to take an input parameter, AU password. So we need to change this AU password to the alias that your password field is going to be using. So in our case, we're going to change it to the UEL_password. And then we're going to come over here and we're going to change it here as well. Now, what this does is it's going to take the input parameter of password. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the input parameter password, so that's the password that the user provided us, and it's going to hash this password and compare it to the hash that is this password right here. And if it's a match, then it'll give us a 1, and if it's not a match, it'll give us a 0. So we'll go ahead and click Update. So now let's go back and we'll do check password verification, and our output parameter is going to be password match, and we'll come up here in the label password verification, and we'll click Save. All right, so now we need to do a condition, and we'll just add a condition block, and we want to check the variable of our password match, and we want to make this a static of 1, and we'll click Save. And so now we just need to finish off this condition block. And so to the right, we're going to add a finish block, and we're going to pass everything. We'll pass the account ID. We're not going to pass the password, but we'll go ahead and pass everything else. And we'll leave it at 201. And the success message is going to be, I'm valid. Let me in. We'll click OK. Now we need to add the condition to the left for the failure. And we're not going to return anything. The status code will be not found. Success will be 0. And the message is going to be the password provided is not correct. And we'll click Save. Okay, so now that we have this configured, why don't we go ahead and take a look. Now, one thing to remember is that the password is case sensitive. So if you remember, our registration used a capital J, so we'll go ahead and do that. And we'll click debug. And you can see that it's we got a success and it says it's I'm valid, let me in. Now if we change this to a lowercase j and click debug, you can see that it says the password is not correct. So we also want to check to make sure that the email validation is working. So we'll just go ahead and delete that M and we'll click debug again, and it should give us an error saying that the email address is not found. There you go. So that's how you configure the authorization of when a user registers via email and password. So now we want to work on the flow for when a user registered with an external service, such as Facebook or Google. So this is going to be a little bit more complicated because we're going to have to see if they've already registered previously. And if they don't have an account registered, then we're going to automatically go ahead and register that account. So it's going to be kind of a login and registration all in one. So why don't we go ahead and get started. So the first thing we'll do is come up to our API configuration and we'll add a new API. And this API name is going to be external login. And the category is going to be user. And our input parameters are going to be first name. And that's going to be required. Last name. Required. Email. Required. And that's going to be in an email format. And the next one is going to be external user ID. So that's going to be the user ID from Facebook or from Google. Then we're also going to need external provider ID. So that's going to be the ID of Google or Facebook. Remember, we added the table, so it's either going to be a 1 or 2 in this case because those are the only 2 that we have. And we're going to go ahead and make those required. And that'll be it for now. So we'll go ahead and click next. So the first thing we want to do is to make sure that the account doesn't already exist. So we're going to add a query block. And this one is going to be check external user. And the table we're going to use is user external login. And we'll go ahead and click next. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to check to make sure that the user doesn't exist. And if they do exist, we want to go ahead and provide the user account ID. And we want to use the save and next. And we want to make sure that the external user ID equals our external user ID here, and where our authorization provider equals our provider ID here. So we'll go ahead and click save. And now we'll go ahead and add a condition block. So we want to change it to flow, and we want to check the external user. So if this condition is a success, then we want to go ahead and update the user information and return that information back to the app. So we're going to insert to the right a query. This query is going to update the user information. Now, is that necessary? No, you can always just use the information that's in the database, but if the user went and changed their name or anything, we want to go ahead and update it to the latest information because the API that we're going to be using is always going to provide that information. So we're going to say update user info, and the query type is going to be update, and it's going to be our user external login, and we'll go ahead and click next. All right, so the information that we want to update is the first name, last name, and the email, and we'll go ahead and add the modified date as well. So for the first name, we're going to choose first name, we're going to choose last name, and we're going to choose email, and for the modified date, we're going to change it to now. Now again, make sure that this checkbox is selected so it knows that it's a MySQL function. And we're going to update where we're going to use the external login ID. And we've got the external ID from our check external user. So we're going to set it to our external login ID. And we'll click save. And now we want to go ahead and return the values to our app. So we'll insert after a query block. And this one's going to be return external data. And we're going to do the external login. And we'll click next. And what we want to return is the user account ID, the first name, last name, and the email. And we'll click Save and Next. And we're going to return it where our user external login ID is equal to our check external login ID right here. And we'll click Save. Now we can add a finish block. And we want to return these values right here. So we're going to return the user account ID and the first name, the last name, and email. And the message is going to be external account found. You are logged in. And we'll click Save. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is finish off this condition block. So it didn't find the user in the external database. So what's going to happen then? Well, we need to check to make sure that they don't have an existing account in our email database. So we're going to come over here and we're going to do an insert left. And we're going to do another query. And we're going to check to see if that email address provided by the external service exists in our email database. And we're going to label this check existing email. And our main table is going to be the email login. And we'll go ahead and click next. All right, so we want to return this user account ID. And we'll click Save and Next, where our email is equal to our input parameter email. And we'll click Save. Now we'll add a condition block to check that query. So we're going to change it to flow. And we're going to check existing email. If it's a success, then the email address that is provided by the external service already exists. So that means that the user has already registered the email address provided by Facebook or Google, and they've registered previously using email and password. So what we'll need to do is insert a new record in our external user database. So we'll go ahead and click Save here. And what this will do is this will end up linking the two accounts together. So we're going to insert to the right a query. This is going to be insert for existing. So we're going to insert a record in our external table for an existing record. So the query type will be insert. And it will be our user external login. We'll click next. And we're going to choose our user account ID, our authorization provider, the first name, the last name, email, added date, modified date, and the status. And the user account ID is the foreign key that's going to link it back to the email address. So we're going to come down and we're going to check this field right here that we return in our check existing email. It's the user account ID. And then the authorization provider is going to be the external provider ID, our first name, our last name, the email, the added date. We're going to come over here and we're going to select now. The modified date, now, and the status we're going to choose as active. And then we can click Save. So now that we've inserted the fields that we need, let's go ahead and add another query. And we're going to insert after query. And this query is going to return the fields that we want back to our front end. So the query name, we're going to call it return user external data. And our main table is going to be our user external login. And we'll go ahead and click next. And we want to return the user account, our first name, last name, and email. And then we'll click Save and Next. And for the where clause, we want to use the user external login ID. And our input parameter is going to be our insert for existing. and it's going to be the insert ID. We'll go ahead and select that, and we'll click on Save. And so now we just need to add a finish block. So we'll come to Insert After, Finish, and we'll come down and we'll want to check this Return User External Data. And we'll go ahead and change these names to User ID. And then we'll change it to first name, last name, and email. The message, we're going to put existing account found, new account added. And we'll click on Save. Okay, so let's take a look at where we are. So the user has selected to log in via Facebook or Google, and we've called those APIs and we've gotten the data from them. And the first thing we're doing is we're checking to see if they've previously used Facebook or Google. If they have, we're updating our user information, and we're going to return information back to our app and let them log in. If they haven't used Google or Facebook before, we are going to check to see if they've logged in before using their password and email. And if they have, we're going to insert a new record in our external database for their Google or Facebook login. And we're going to return the data and let them log in. So now what we need to do is configure it so if they haven't ever used Facebook or Google and they haven't used their email and password, so in essence, they're a brand new user. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to insert to the left a query block, and this query is going to be create user account, and the query type is going to be an insert, and the main table is going to be user account. We'll click next. Now we want to do our added date, modified date, and status. And the added date again is going to be our MySQL statement now. The modified date again is going to be now as well, and our status will be active. We'll click Save. So now what we need to do is go ahead and insert the new Facebook or Google into our external table. And so we'll right click and insert after another query. And we're going to call this insert new external. And this is going to be an insert query. And our table is going to be the external login. We'll click next. And we want to go ahead and insert all of these fields except for the first one because we want that one to auto increment. Now the user account ID is going to be the insert ID that we just created by inserting into the create user account. And then our authorization provider is going to be our external provider ID. External user ID is our external user ID. And first name, last name, and email. As always, our added date is going to be our MySQL function now, and our modified date the same. And then the status will be active. Okay, so now that we've inserted the data, we want to go ahead and do another query to return that data back so we can use it in the app. So we'll insert another query. And we're going to call this one return user data. And the main table is going to be our external login. And we'll click next. And we want to go ahead and return our first name, last name, email, and this user account ID. We'll click Save and Next. And we want to do that where our user external login ID is equal to the insert ID that we just created by inserting the new record into our insert new external query. And click Save. Now we can add a finish block. And we'll uncheck that, and we want to come down here and we want to return this query right here, our return user data, and we're going to just edit the names a little bit. Last name, and then this one we're just going to make email, and the last one will be user account ID, and the message is going to be no account found, new account created, and we'll click Save. All right, so now that we have the API configured, why don't we go ahead and test it? So we'll come up to the top, and the first thing we want to do is we'll create a first name, let's say John, and the last name will be Smith. The email will be john@smith.com. And our external user ID will be 1234, and the provider ID, let's say, is going to be 1, which would be a Facebook login. We'll click debug. All right, so now you can see that we have a message of no account found, new account created, which is exactly what it should do. And we can take a look at this in our MySQL table. Okay, so the first thing we want to take a look at is our user account. So again, this is the main table that's going to link all of our registrations, and everything will flow off of this user account ID. So you can see here that we had the first one from when we registered with an email and password, and now we have user account ID number 2, which we just created. Now this is the user external login, so you can see it's ID of number 1, and here's our foreign key that links it back to our user account table, and here's all of our data, the external user ID, which would come from Google or Facebook, first name, last name, and the other thing is this authorization provider 1, which means it was a Facebook login. So now let's go ahead and take a look at if we were to try to create an account with this information right here when we created a username and password. So in this one, we'll do Jane Smith, and the email we're going to change to j@j.com, and we'll go ahead and use a Google, and we'll change the external user ID to include a 6. So now we can go ahead and click debug. All right, and you can see it says existing account found, new login added. So it found that we had previously registered with our email address, and it went ahead and added a new record. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at that? So the first thing we'll take a look at is the user account, and we'll click refresh. So you see it didn't add a new user account because it's using this first one right here. And we'll take a look at the next. This is our email, so we'll click refresh. It didn't add anything to our email, but if we click refresh on our external, we should see a new record here, which it just added, and it's Jane Smith, and there's the email at j@j.com, and our authorization provider was Google, and you see here in this foreign key, it's linked back to our user account ID number 2. So now what we want to do is go ahead and test that our update query is working. So we're going to check to see if it's an external user, and it's going to find this record right here. And we want to go ahead and update the info. So we want to change it, say, from Jane Smith. Let's change it to Jane Doe. And we'll go ahead and click debug. And again, we got the message external account found. You are logged in. And we got a return right here. So return Jane Doe. Let's go ahead and take a look at it in our table. And we'll go ahead and click refresh. And you can see that our table was modified to change it to Jane Doe. So now that we've checked all of the flows, we can verify that our API is working. Now let's go ahead and tie this to the front end. So now that we have the back end configured, why don't we go ahead and configure the front end and start tying everything together. So I've gone ahead and created a new page called register, and let's go ahead and start adding some controls to it. The first control we want to add are a couple of buttons. Now let's go ahead and configure our button. And the first thing we're going to do is change the position and size. So we're going to do 10, 50, 300, and 44 is fine. The object ID is going to be button Facebook because this is going to be our Facebook button. Let's scroll down and we'll take a look at the title. And we want to go ahead and remove the button title. And the reason being is we're going to actually use an image. So we're going to go ahead and select that image. And we'll use our sign in with Facebook. So let's change to highlighted. And we'll go ahead and select that image as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at our advanced properties. And we'll go ahead and set this to expand, and we'll click save. Now the next thing we want to do is go ahead and clone this. And let's go ahead and set the positioning. So this one's going to be 10. The Y position is going to be 110. The width will be 300. And the height will be 44. The object ID, we're going to call it button Google, because this is going to be our Google button. And let's go ahead and change the image. So the first thing we want to do is go to our button state and go to normal and have the normal title deleted, and we'll select our normal background. And we'll choose our Google. Now we need to go to our button state highlighted, and we need to change this background as well. So we'll select our Google image. Okay, so now we have our Facebook and our Google buttons. Now we need to give the user their opportunity to use their email and password. So what we want to do is go ahead and drag over a label. And basically what this label is going to do is all it's going to do is it's going to have the value OR. So, but we still want to position it, and we're going to position it at 140. And the Y position is going to be 160. And it's going to be a 40 in width and 20 in height. And we'll call this label OR. The font, we're going to change it. Instead of a bold, we're going to use a light. So we'll choose Helvetica Light, and the font size, we'll take it down to 13. The text alignment, we want to change it from left to center. So now we want to go ahead and add our input fields. So the first thing we want to do is drag over a text field. All right, so let's go ahead and size and position this one. So this is going to be for our first name. So it's going to be at 10, 190, 300, and the height is going to be 50. Object ID is going to be text, first name. The max number of lines is going to be 1. And we want to go ahead and change this font to Helvetica Light. And the font size, we want to make it at 15. Text alignment left. And the placeholder is we're going to put in first name. And the border style, we're actually going to turn the border style off and apply our own border. And the clear button we'll put as always visible. And the keyboard type we can do as default, and the appearance is default. The return key, we'll go ahead and put in next. Instead of showing a return key, they'll hit the next button, and that will move to the next field. Come down here and we're going to add a border. And the border color is going to be a light gray. So now that we have that field configured the way we want, we can go ahead and clone it. Let's go ahead and configure this one. This is going to be for our last name. So it's going to be at 10. And we want to position it right up against the first name. And the width is going to be 300, height of 50. And the object ID is going to be text, last name. We want to leave everything else the same except for our placeholder text. So we'll type in place. And then we'll just come down here and type in last name. Now we can go ahead and clone this one. And what we're going to do with this field, this is going to be for our email, and this is actually going to sit right on top of the first name field. And once we get all of our text fields positioned, we're going to go ahead and provide the ability for the user to select whether they're signing in or if they're registering via email and password. And if they're registering, then it will it'll move the fields exposing the first name and last name, and it's actually kind of a neat little animation. So for this one, we want to, again, position it right over top of the first name. So it's going to be at 10, 190. The width is 300. The height is 50. And the text field is going to be text. And it's going to be email. So now we want to change the placeholder text. And we're going to put in an email address. And we also want to change the keyboard. So we want to change the keyboard type so that it can actually use an email address. And what that does is that puts the @ symbol on the main part of the keyboard. And now we want to add the password. So we'll clone this one. And so this is going to be used for the password, and it's going to sit right on top of the last name. So this is going to be at 10, 240. The width is 300. The height is 50. And the object ID is going to be text password. And we want to change the placeholder text. And we're going to type in password. And now we want to change our keyboard type again. And instead of email address, we want to go ahead and do our default. But we also want to add secure. So secure text entry, and we're going to put it as yes. And what that will do is instead of showing the characters type, it'll actually put an asterisk. So now that we have our fields in, we need to go ahead and add an additional button. So we're going to click on our Facebook button. All right, so let's go ahead and clone our Facebook button. And this is going to be our button for our sign in with our email and password. So we'll go ahead and position this as 10, 300, 300 is fine, 44, and our object ID is going to be button, email. Now we want to go ahead and change the image. So we'll scroll down until we get to our highlighted image, and we're going to go in and select sign in with email. And then we'll go up here and choose our normal image. And we'll choose sign in with email as well. Okay, so now we want to add an additional button, and this additional button will switch between signing in and registration. So let's go ahead and pull over another button. This button, we're going to go ahead and position it at, let's say, 60, and the Y position will be 355, and it'll be 200, and the height will be 30. And we're going to call this button create. All right, so let's go down and we'll configure this. And the font family, we're going to just do Helvetica, and right here, and we're just going to do light. And we're going to lower the font size to 14. And the button state for normal, it's actually going to say create an account. So when they select this button, this email address and password will slide down, revealing the first name and last name so that they can go ahead and put that in and create an account. The normal title color, let's go ahead and put in 1C9689. That's the color to match our email button. And we want to come down here, and the background color we just want to remove so that we just get the text. Now we want to change our button state to selected, and the selected title is going to be already have an account. So what this will do is this will hide the first name and last name entry fields and go ahead and let the user sign in with an already registered account. Last thing we need to do is actually come up here, and we need to turn this on, is toggle button. And basically that's going to turn it into a yes, no. All right, so now what we need to do is go ahead and provide functionality to move these fields down. So the way we're going to do that is with this button selected, we're going to come up here to actions and click, and we're going to do add animation. And so now what we need to do is add an animation to go ahead and move those fields out of the way. The first thing we want to do is half a second is the animation duration, and we're going to start at the bottom and move our way up. So the first one is the button create. So when we're talking about the start frame, if you check this right here, the way you have to put it in is by the X coordinate, the Y coordinate, the width, and the height. So if we look at our create button, then it's going to be at 60, 355, 200, and 30. So if we go ahead and copy those and paste those into our end frame. The end frame is where we want it to finish at. So we don't want to change the size, so we'll keep the 230, and all we need to do is go ahead and change the vertical or the Y coordinate, which is this 355. And we know that there's two controls that are going to be unhidden, each one at 50 pixels. So we'll go ahead and change this to 455. So we're going to move everything down 100 pixels. So we'll go ahead and clone that. And the next one that we want to work on is not the button create, but we want to work on our button email. So we'll go ahead and click save. And this one is at 10, 300, 300, and 44. So we'll copy that and we'll paste it here. And all we want to do is change the 300 to 400. Now we can duplicate that one. So the next control is the text password. And the text password was at 10, 240, 300, and 50. So we'll copy that and we'll paste it. And again, all we want to do is just move it down 100 pixels. So instead of 240, it'll be 340. So we'll do one more. And this one is going to not be for the text password, but it's going to be for the email. And the email, instead of 240, it's actually 190. And we'll copy that and paste it and change the 190 to 290. Now we only want this to happen when the button is selected. So we're going to add a condition and we're going to choose our form object and we're going to do the button create when it equals 1. So what that means is once someone selects that button create has a value of 1 and it will fire these actions right here. So it'll move everything down, revealing the first name and last name. To get the reverse to happen, we want to go ahead and clone this case. Now we want to come over here to condition and we want to change it to 0. So it's going back to its regular form. Now what we need to do is just change these. So all we're doing is just changing the end frame and the start frame, just the Y coordinate. So this one's going to be, the start frame is going to be 290 and this one end frame is going to be 190. Now we'll change this one from 240 to 340 and this one from 340 to 240. And this one will change from 300 to 400 and this one will change from 400 to 300. And then this one will change from 355 to 455 and this one will change from 455 to 355. Now we'll go ahead and click save. Now why don't we go ahead and take a look at this in the app. So we'll go ahead and click refresh. Okay, so now we have our email. And if we click in there, you can see that it gives the email keyboard. And if we click on password, you can see that it hides all of our characters. Now, if we go ahead and click on the create an account, so you can see that the animation reveals the first name and last name. And if we click on already have an account, then it hides those fields again. And now we can go ahead and sign in with our email. So to do that, let's go ahead and attach our data sources and configure those APIs. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is go ahead and add our data sources. And we'll come over here and click on add data source. And the first data source we want to add is our user email registration. And we can go ahead and assign our sources. So for the first name, we're going to do form object. And it's going to be the text field first name. And for last name, it's going to be form object again. Text last name. And for email, same thing. And for password, guess what? It's going to be the same thing, form object, and then we'll just choose the text password field. We'll hit execute. Okay, and so these are our output parameters, and we'll click save. All right, so now we want to go ahead and add an additional data source. And this one, we're going to use our user email verify. So this is when they log in. And this is going to be form object. And it's going to be our email. And then for the password, again, it's going to be the form object password. So again, we're using the same fields, the password and the email fields for both registration and for login. So we'll click execute and see there's our fields right there. We'll click save. Now let's go ahead and add the other data sources. All right, so now we need to go ahead and add the Facebook and the Google data source. And to do that, we're going to click on third party. And we're going to come down here in Facebook. We're going to click on user details. And we want to change this API to Facebook login. And we'll take a look at the output parameters. So here are all the output parameters that we can get off of Facebook. All we're looking for is, again, the ID, the first name, the last name, and the email address. So we'll click save. So now let's go ahead and add our Google login. So we'll click on add data source. So now we want to turn third party back on. And we're going to come down and we're going to take a look at the Google user details. Now, this input parameter right here, this is used if you're looking up an additional Google user, but for our instance, we're not using that, so we'll just click on static and leave the value blank. Now, what we want to do is change this API name to Google Plus. Now we can take a look at the output parameters, and here's all the output parameters that you get from the Google Plus. We'll click Save. So now what we need to do is go ahead and configure that when the Facebook and Google APIs return their values, we need to pass those values onto our external table API. So the way we do that is we're going to come over here to add an event, and when the data source is loaded, we want to go ahead and save those parameters as session variables. So we're going to set save in session permanently. And the first one we're going to do is first name. And the source value is going to be response. And we're going to set the response as first name. Now we can duplicate this. And we're going to change first name to last name. And we'll set that to last name. Duplicate it again. And from last name, we're going to type in email. And we're going to select email. Now, the fourth one we need is the user ID. So we're going to type in external user ID. And we're going to set that to up here to ID. Now we can click Save. And we'll come over here and do the same thing for Google. Data source loaded. And we want to do Save Session Permanently. And our parameter name, instead of doing static, because we've already done static, now they're existing in our session. So we can come down to our session and we can do first name, and it's going to be response. And we're going to do given name, and then we'll duplicate that. Change this to last name, and it'll be family name. And now we'll want the email, and we'll come down and we'll click on email. And the last one is going to be the external user ID. And we're going to choose identifier. We'll click identifier. Now we can duplicate this, and we want to add our authentication ID. So we're going to choose our external auth ID that we added in the Facebook. and the source value is actually going to be a static, and we're going to do 2 because remember, Facebook is for 1 and Google is for 2. So we'll go ahead and click Save. So now that we have those configured, we can add our last data source. So we'll click on Add Data Source, and we can scroll down and use our external login. Now for first name, we want to go ahead and use session variables. And the session variable is going to be first name. And for last name, session variable, last name. And for email, session variable, email. And for the external user ID, it's going to be session external user ID. And the provider ID is going to be session, and it's going to be external auth ID. All right, we can go and click Save. So now we need to know when to go ahead and fire this external login API. And the way we do that is we're going to come back into our Facebook login. And when the data source is loaded, after it's saved all of these session variables, we're going to go ahead and add an action to fire that API. So we're going to come down and we're going to trigger an API call. And we want this external login. Now the thing is we have to now move this down to the bottom because everything at the top gets fired in order. So we would need to save these session variables before firing this API. So we'll just click on this down arrow and we'll move it down to the bottom. Okay, so now we have our API call at the bottom. So now we want to go ahead and add a condition. We'll go ahead and add condition. And we want to make sure that our response for our Facebook, we actually get a success. So we're going to type in success, and then our value is going to be 1. And then we want to go ahead and add a case. And we'll select case 2 and add a condition, and the response is 0. We want to go ahead and have an alert shown. And the title will be uh-oh. And the message will be could not sign into Facebook. Please try again. And the alert button title will be OK. And we'll go ahead and click Save. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for Google, and we'll expand that. Click on Data Source Loaded. Now we need to add our API. So we're going to trigger Data Source API call, and we want to trigger this external login and move it down to the bottom. All right, and now we want to add our condition that our response success equals 1, and then add another case, and then this condition will be response success equals 0, and we want to go ahead and add a show alert, and it'll be uh-oh, and the message will be could not sign into Google, please try again. And our title will be OK. So now all we need to do is select our sign in with Facebook button, and we want to go ahead and do our action click, and we want to trigger an API call, and we'll go ahead and choose our API call. So we'll do Facebook login, We'll choose our Google, and we'll go ahead and do our API call with on click. Then we'll do our Google+. Click Save. Now with our email, remember it does both our registration and login, so we'll have to configure 2 cases. So we'll click on Actions, click, and the first one we want to go ahead and trigger an API call for the sign-in. So it's going to be user email verify, and the condition will be if our form object, which will be our button create, equals 0, that means it's going to be using the sign-in. Then we'll duplicate this, and we'll click on case 2. And we still want to trigger an API call, but in this case we want to do a registration if the condition equals 1. So we'll click Save. Now there's 2 other things we need to do. Is we need to come to our external login, and we want to do when data source is loaded, and we want to go ahead and save a new session variable. So we'll save in session permanently, and this session variable is going to be user account ID. And we want to go ahead and do a response, and it's going to be this user account ID right here. Click Save. And we also want to do that on our email registration and on our email sign up. So for our registration, we'll come down to, we'll type in save, and we want to save session permanently, and the session will be our user account ID, and it's going to be a response, and it's going to be a user account ID. Click Save. And we'll do the same thing for our email sign-in. Data source loaded. And we're going to save. And we'll do session, user account ID, and the response is going to be user account ID. Now, why do we do that? Well, when the user returns to the app, you don't want to necessarily make them visit to this page if they already have signed in. So the way we avoid that is by looking to see if the app has a user ID field already in it. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to come over to our screen list, and we're going to go to our splash, which is right here, and we'll click on the main view, and we'll come over here for actions and this time completed. So right now it's set up to redirect to our register page, but we only want to do the register if we come over here and do a condition if the session variable is empty. So we're going to choose our user account ID. If it equals, is it empty, then we want it to go ahead and send us to the register page. Now, the other option is we'll go ahead and clone this. We want them to actually send us to the tab bar if it's not empty. So that means it has a value. So that means that the user's already registered and logged in. And if it has a value, we want it to go ahead and send it to the tab bar. So we'll go ahead and click Save. So now we have to configure what happens once we're logged in. So let's go back to our page, and we're going to go down to our register, and we'll come back to our data sources. And the first one, let's take out the user email registration. We'll go back to data source loaded. So as you can see, we're saving the session variable, but we want to go ahead and redirect. And so we're going to redirect to the tab bar. And we want to do that after we save the session variable. So we'll move that down, and we only want to do this on the condition that our response is a success. So we'll say success equals 1. Now we need to duplicate this, and we'll select case number 2. We'll add a condition, and we'll say that if the response success equals 0, then we want to show an alert. And the title will be uh-oh, and the message is actually going to be our response message. So we'll choose response, and then we'll choose message. And our button title will be OK. Now we need to do the same thing for our user email. And we'll click data source loaded. We'll click add action. And we want to redirect to the tab bar. And our condition will be our response success equals 1. And then we'll add a case. Click on case 2, and we're going to response success equals 0. Then we're going to show an alert. And the title will be uh-oh. And the response will be, the message will be the response message. And we'll type in OK for the button title. And now the last one is our external login. We'll click on data source loaded, add an action, and we're going to redirect. And we want to redirect to our tab bar. And let's move that after we save the session. And then we'll go ahead and add our condition that it was a success. So our response, then our value is the success equals 1. And then we'll add another case. And our action is going to be show an alert. Message title, uh-oh. And our message will be a response message. OK. And then we'll add the condition that our response success equals 0. And we'll click save. So now that we have all that configured, let's take a look at it in the app. All right, so here we go. So let's go ahead and see if I can create an account. So we'll do J next, JH. Next, and the email will be jh@j.com. And the password will be JH. So we'll click sign in. As you can see, it's signed in. So let's go ahead and verify that with the MySQL database. And we'll come down to our user and our user email login. We'll go ahead and view that data. So there you go. So there's the one that we just registered. So now let's go ahead and see if we can sign in. All right, so we're going to go ahead and try and sign in with our j@j.com. And the password was a capital J. All right, so there you go. So now that's signed in and we're good to go on that one. So now why don't we go ahead and test our social media. All right, so let's go ahead and test our Facebook sign in. So we'll click on the sign in with Facebook. And there you go. So we'll take a look at this and make sure that it had everything in the tables. And we'll come down to here to our external and we'll go ahead and view that data. So there you go. So there is our Facebook login that we just did. And you can see that our user account ID is number 4. And we can go ahead and take a look at that by coming over here to our user account and view that data. And you should see 4 records. And there's our 4th one right there. And that's how you configure social media login, the front end, the back end, and all of the APIs. Want to learn more? Visit our Help Center for additional tutorials, our Support Center, and our online community, where our support team will assist you. Keep configuring.